just let me say I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to your screens all around the country and the world, Dr. Sarah Chaney, to give the Voltaire Lecture 2022.
Thanks very much, Adam, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give this talk. Just before I start, as you might guess, in the history of the normal, there are a number of historical examples of racism, sexism, ableism, and other prejudice. So some of that will be covered in this talk tonight. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the examples of the ways in which people have wondered or considered whether they're normal that comes up in my book, this 200-year search for normal people. So the first one I want to start with, because this came at a time when people were really starting to critique the idea of what was normal, is a survey that was carried out in 1949. So this was known as Little Kinsey, named after the Kinsey study of sex lives, and that was carried out by Alfred Kinsey in the United States in subsequent previous years. And Little Kinsey was carried out by a group of left-wing researchers, mass observation. It was founded by left-wing researchers in 1937, and they intended to create what they called an anthropology of ourselves. So this was a study of everyday life in Britain that was based on surveys, documents, diaries, personal documents gathered by a mixture of volunteer respondents and paid researchers. So they carried out this big study on people's attitudes towards sexual behaviour, which also included a large number of questionnaires sent to their volunteer panel on their own sexual preferences and habits. And what's interesting in this survey towards the end is that we have one question kind of down the bottom on the type sheet here. On the whole, would you say that you yourself are sexually normal or not? And there was a huge range of answers to this question. So these are just a few. Some people answered it unproblematically, yes, or sometimes unproblematically, no. But a lot of people raised questions or issues about the idea of normal itself. And it was quite clear that what was normal differed for different groups. So as one person put it, yes, they thought they were normal, but at the same time must admit that I have no knowledge of what the norm might be. Others acknowledged that while they considered themselves normal by the laws in society at that time, homosexuality was illegal at that time, they might not be considered normal. So for a homosexual, I am normal. Others just asked, can you define normal? And then one very interesting answer by a particular person who attached a whole other sheet to go into this in depth. He noted that I consider that in relation to the whole of society, I am not normal, say within the quartiles. But then in relation to my own group of society, single, male, living away from home, well-educated, medium income group, I am normal, in that group of which I form a part is also normal to society as a whole. So definitions of normal really differ depending on who's defining it, what group you're talking about, who you're comparing yourself to. And this period in the post-war era, late 1940s and through the 1950s, a lot of people were starting to critique this idea of what was normal, perhaps to a greater extent than some of us do today. So what I'm going to go through in this talk is some of the history to this term, why people started to ask themselves whether they were normal, what the idea meant and what it has meant in different eras, and how it's been affected by these changes in relation to the whole of society, as this person put it here. So I'm going to start off with the history of the term normal, which was not applied to human beings at all before the 1830s, and how that came from a mathematical term to be used to understand human beings and behaviour. Then I'm going to use an example from my book, the chapter, Do I Have a Normal Body?, to look at, is there really any such thing? What is a normal body, and does it exist in the world? Then from Do I Have a Normal Mind? We look at what's actually common mental experiences, and are some experiences perhaps less uncommon than we might assume. Then I'm going to use an example from people's worries about whether their children are normal, and look at how changes in society and social structures alter the boundaries of what we think of as being normal. And then look at how some of the assumptions made across all of these areas of research, and some assumptions that have been kind of ongoing throughout this 200-year history, actually lead us to ask the question, is society normal, and what does that mean? And then finally, just some conclusions about why I think we should care about this. Why is this history important to us today? So starting off with the first section, what is normal? So if you think about the last time you used the word normal, what did you actually mean by it? Possibly you meant whether something was average, or it was a mean of a particular distribution, a mathematical average. Perhaps you meant something seemed to be more or less usual. Perhaps you meant it was common. Perhaps you were wondering whether you were just like other people. But what other people were you actually comparing yourself to? So as we've seen from the sex survey, normal means different things in different contexts. And before the 1830s, it was simply a mathematical term, but in both statistics and in medicine, in the 1830s, normal began to be used to describe human behaviour. And one of the reasons for this was this graph, this type of graph. This isn't exactly a normal distribution, but more on that in a moment. So the normal distribution, which should be more symmetrical than this, is a bell curve, which appears to simply describe human characteristics. So in this example, these are the chest measurements of 5,738 Scottish soldiers in 1817 in inches. The most frequent measurements in the graph are at the centre, the rounded peak, 39 or 40, 41 inches, and then it tails off to either side, where far fewer soldiers have these smaller or larger chest measurements. Now, this is something that many of us are used to today. Perhaps we might have learned about it in school, but it was in the 1830s that this graph started to be applied to human behaviour, to human characteristics. And it came originally not from the measurement of humans, but from the measurement of stars and planets. So one of the first people to use this statistical method of studying things was a German mathematician, Carl Friedrich Gauss. Now, astronomers had long known, before Gauss used this measurement in 1801, that the measurements that they made were subject to errors. And they knew that very small errors were much more common than very large errors. And when Gauss decided to use this method to plot the path of a new planet named Ceres in 1801, you can see some of his other workings on the right-hand side here. He was able to plot the path because he accounted for error in measurements. And he used what was known at the time as the astronomer's error curve, or what became known as the astronomer's error curve. So for astronomers, if we think back to the shape of this graph, this chart does not only show what happens to exist, as it might do in the case of a group of Scottish soldiers and their chest measurements, but it also shows a correct measurement. So for an astronomer, if they were measuring a distance, all of these measurements would be slight errors, and the very centre of the chart would be the correct measurement. Now, Adolf Quetelet, who's an astronomer and a statistician, was the man who realised that he could use this same statistical methodology to examine human measurements. And he was very interested in the Scottish soldiers, this data that he actually gathered from elsewhere. He used large amounts of data that other people had gathered, that had been gathered through censuses and through other studies, and looked at how often it fell on this curve. But the important point to note is that because Quetelet, as an astronomer, also saw the curve as an error curve, the centre became the correct measurement. So for these soldiers, normal is the mean of the chart, 39.83 inches at the chest, and then all these other soldiers are simply errors. And Quetelet used the analogy and example of the Scottish soldiers of comparing this to casts of a statue. And he took the Borghese gladiator, which was seen as an ideal human form, statue from 100 BC, and said that it was as if all of these Scottish soldiers were slightly misshapen casts of this same statue. Therefore, again, at the very centre of the error curve was the correct measurements of a Scottish soldier or a ancient gladiator, and all these others were slightly misshapen casts. So for Quetelet, the average man, as he called it, was also the ideal. So these two things were linked from the very beginnings of the application of normal to human beings. In 1877, Francis Galton, who we'll come back to a bit later on, began to use the term normal distribution to describe the error curve. And normal has infiltrated our lives ever since, often without us even questioning what we mean by it. As Quetelet put it, every quality taken within suitable limits is essentially good. It is only in its extreme deviations from the mean that it becomes bad. And all of this was inspired by his understanding of astronomy, of the error curve, linked to his understanding of statistics. So for him, everything that was in the centre of the curve was held to be essentially good. And he also assumed that this notion of an average or an ideal measurement must apply to everything. So it applied to all kinds of human qualities, not just things that could be studied on such a chart. But if from the very beginning, normal has meant both average and ideal, who or what is the definition of it? And does it even exist? So I want to turn now into an example of a method of analysing the normal body that considered whether an average human actually existed. So these two statues that you can see on the screen here are Norman and Norma. So they were designed from the average of tens of thousands of measurements of American men and women. They were created by sexologist Robert Dickinson and sculptor Abraham Belsky in 1942 and displayed to the public at Cleveland Health Museum in 1945. Now, a very important point to note is that Norman and Norma were not based on all men and women, and this is the case throughout huge numbers of these examples of trying to define and understand normal, that it never means everyone. So Norman and Norma were based largely on young, aged 18 to 25, white American-born people. And the original label that was placed on the statues in the museum was, and I quote, native white American. So this reinforced an assumption that was held by the creators of the statues and presumably the museum directors as well, that a normal American was a white American-born person. So this held up a certain perceived standard, which, as very often is the case, was all resistant. But what's interesting then is that a local paper tried to do a search for the real life Norma. They weren't interested in the real life Norman, which again indicates the way that sexist judgments also often interplay with these definitions of what's normal. It was seen as much more acceptable to them to expect women to measure themselves and to define themselves by their bodies. But this local paper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, published this search for Norma in 1945. Now, they only asked for 9 measurements. Women had to fill in this form you can see on the screen here, ring which one was close to all of these 9 measurements of the statue. And they managed to receive nearly 4,000 entries. 3,864 women entered the competition. And here you can see the winner, Martha Skidmore, who's a former war worker turned theatre cashier, pictured next to the statue of Norma. But even Martha did not meet the measurements precisely. She was simply the woman who came closest. And in fact, the competition judges requested for the mere 1% of women who came anywhere near these statistics to come in and to be remeasured to try and find someone who matched the statue, but found that this was not the case. So nobody had the average of all of these measurements. So not only was the average creating this kind of ideal, as according to Quetelet, but it was also an ideal that didn't exist in real life. And perhaps this wouldn't have surprised some of the authors of one of the studies on which Norma's measurements were based. And this was a 1940 study that measured 15,000 American women for garment and pattern construction. Now, again, these efforts to develop standardized clothing sizes were also exclusionary. They were based entirely on white women for reasons not stated by the investigators, who, according to this pamphlet with their results, they even took the measurements of some black women who volunteered to be part of the study, as they put it, for the sake of good feeling within a group, but then promptly discarded them, but they didn't specify why. But despite the limits placed on the sample, which was also largely of younger women, the results proved to be bewildering, and they concluded that this made the average woman of limited usefulness. As you can see in the quote on the slide here, the nation's 40 million white women 18 years old and over present, as everyday observation testifies, an almost bewildering variety of shapes and sizes. Nor can this variability be described completely by one or even a few measurements, since women do not yield to so simple a classification. And they noted again that a surprisingly large proportion of women are short but stout or tall but slender. Women with the same girth of bust frequently differ by as much as 5 or 6 inches in hip girth. So it was very unlikely for any women to be average in all measurements. And yet, of course, for reasons of economy, standardised clothing sizes did become a matter of course in the post-war era. And this is the case across a large variety of things that we use that are standardised on an average in order to it is hoped to be most useful to the vast majority of people. And one example that I saw fairly recently in the BBC in June 2022, they reported there had been a number of problems on not the South Western Ambulance Service as in the picture, but East of England ambulances, which have been standardised to make them cheaper to produce and stock. And that had apparently led to 160 problems for staff due to the lack of adjustability. So injuries, including back pain, but also safety issues, such as a lack of visibility and pedals being too close together. So when we design something on an average, thinking that is normal, as we've seen with Norma average woman, it may not suit anyone at all. So if the average normal person doesn't actually exist, what other ways historically have people tried to judge what's normal? So sometimes this has been by what's thought to be healthy or what's common, or even perhaps what's not unusual. But there have been some surprising results in studies that have investigated this. And there's one that I want to mention to you, which is the Census of Hallucinations of 1889. I want to take you back, first of all, to Plumstead, southeast London in 1886, where Mr. Joseph Kirk of Ripon Villas was getting ready to start his day. As he was dressing, Mr. Kirk heard the door downstairs slam, and he realised to his annoyance that the milkman must be late yet again. This had been a regular occurrence recently, and that Mary, the servant, must have had to go out to buy milk for his breakfast. He went downstairs to join his wife in the breakfast room, and on his way, he passed Mary in the hallway. She was dressed in her usual outdoor clothes, just coming back from purchasing milk. So When he got into the breakfast room, Mr. Kirk exclaimed his annoyance to his wife, saying, the milkman hasn't turned up yet again, and Mary has had to go out to buy milk. Whatever do you mean? His wife said. Mary hasn't left the house all morning. And that was when Mr. Kirk realised that his vision of Mary in the hallway had been just that, a very lifelike hallucination. So this is just one rather mundane example from the census of hallucinations that was carried out by the Society for Psychical Research. Now, this society was founded in 1882 by a group of scientists, philosophers and artists to scientifically investigate supposedly paranormal phenomena, ranging from ghostly visitations to seances that you can see on the left there with Italian medium Eusapia Palladino, to telepathy. And there was a huge range of opinions within the society. So a number of members regarded all of these things as an absolute hoax. Others felt that there might be unexplained laws of science out there, which could be better understood by investigating these things. And the census of hallucinations emerged from the work of this man here, Edmund Gurney, who unfortunately died in 1888, just before the census began. But he'd already written a lot about hallucinations and his concern about the views that people had about these experiences. As he put it in the publication of 1886, there's a certain vague prejudice in the minds of persons who have never met with an instance of hallucination of any sort. Such persons can often hardly bring themselves to conceive that a sane, healthy, waking mind can really get momentarily off the rails and convey voices where there is silence and figures where there is vacancy. So the Society decided to launch this investigation, which they began in 1889. And you can see the questionnaire form on the right-hand side. The main question being to all respondents, have you ever, when believing yourself to be completely awake, had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched by a living being or inanimate object, or of hearing a voice, which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external physical cause? And they managed to, by the usual Victorian methodology of sharing this questionnaire with friends and friends of friends and so on, managed to get 17,000 responses to the survey. And 13% of these people, 2,272, said that they had experienced these things. So while hallucinations were not a majority experience, it turns out that seeing or hearing things that others did not was perhaps a bit more common than previously had been anticipated and necessarily associated with mental or physical illness. And again, we can find examples of people questioning this before this time. Particularly interesting is the questioning by some psychiatric patients. So I want to mention one patient here, Walter Abraham Haig, who was admitted to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in 1882. He was a young man, he was a tutor with a university education. He stayed for 4 years, certified as insane, so sectioned perhaps in modern terminology, and was later readmitted as a voluntary patient. And Haig, interestingly, was credited in textbooks by two of the Bethlehem physicians of that time, George Savage and Theo Hislop. So he was obviously speaking to and, according to his case notes, supporting them with their research. And Walter Haig wrote a number of letters to his doctors in between his admissions. And he almost always put the words sane and insane into inverted commas. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a letter to Dr. Hislop, which starts with, as you are aware, the sane, I quote, world has little idea of these sense perversions, many of which are classified under the name of insanity. And then on the right-hand side, about halfway down the page in another letter, he writes, as to what my perversions of sensations are, no sane, in inverted commas, person would have any idea. But I do despise those who know I have been certified and who judge ignorantly. Now, George Savage had recorded in his case notes that Walter Haig was convinced he is made where he is by the habits of society pointing to certain people who are peculiar. Interestingly, both George Savage and Theo Hislop began to write about so-called insanity in their own textbooks and to see sanity and insanity as relative terms. This is from later in George Savage's career. He gave a lecture that was published in the British Medical Journal in 1906, where he talked about, he asked his audience, will you be prepared to certify every patient who admits having hallucinations of his senses? Certainly in my earlier asylum experience, I should without any hesitation have said if a man hears voices, he is not safe to be at large. And if he believes that he's being influenced by others in some occult way, he's a dangerous lunatic. Yet you may be surprised to hear that I now have several examples of men suffering from these subjective nervous disorders who are earning their livings and are as free as you or I. So as we can see from the census of hallucinations and from some of this questioning by both patients and by psychiatrists in the late 19th century, some mental experiences might not be as rare as previously have been believed. And this is certainly something that has shown up in subsequent studies of voice hearing and hallucinations. And what's interesting here is that normal studies are not necessarily always normative. So sometimes these large studies show that things that had been viewed as abnormal or unusual are actually more common and perhaps less unhealthy than previously had been believed. So it's very easy to go into this topic just assuming that every attempt to classify people to understand normal behaviour is exclusionary, but that's not necessarily always the case. However, we can also see that changes in society alter the bounds of what was deemed normal. And I want to talk about this through an example of the way in which children have been tested or understood to be normal or not. So again, I'm going to start in the 19th century with an example of one man named James Henry Pullen. So Pullen was born in Dalston in 1835. As a child, he learned more slowly than those around him. He struggled to learn to speak, and no school would have him as a student. So at the age of 15, Pullen was admitted to the Royal Earlswood Asylum. Now this, in the harsh language of the time, was an asylum for so-called idiot children. They were young people aged under 18, and they were identified as struggling or unable to learn in the same way as so-called normal children. But at Earlswood, Pullen's skill in carpentry was discovered. And this on the screen here is his pictorial biography. His language skills remained limited, but he was able to express himself in a number of different ways. And this showed the key moments throughout his life, including the huge model ships that he built during his time at Earlswood when he was given a workshop as a carpenter. Now, Pullen and other children became more frequently identified as education became more widely available and literacy became more highly valued. So Pullen was partly identified because no school would have him as a student, and this was the case for a number of other children admitted to Earlswood and other similar institutions. They were seen to be not learning in the way other children did. 40% of men in this country and only 50% of women could read and write. And by the end of the century, almost 3/4 of both could, and school attendance was made compulsory in 1880. So changes in society alter the views of what's normal or abnormal. If children are not going to school, they will not necessarily be noticed as not learning in the same way as other children. And the IQ test arose from this context of changes. In 1904, psychologist Alfred Binet was asked by the French Minister of Public Education to find ways to support children who struggled in the classroom. He developed a number of tests, and they were based on what he assumed were normal children, including his own children, and tested certain things like comprehension and problem-solving skills that children would be expected to do at a certain age. So he had tests for every age of a child. And then for those children who were learning more slowly, they would be given a mental age, the highest level of tests they were able to complete. German psychologist William Stern then divided the child's mental age by their chronological age, and this led to the IQ score, 100 being the average, because it was seen as the mental age and chronological age being the same. Now, of course, that only works in children, and Binet's tests were only designed to identify children who struggled, and so that they could be supported. And they weren't intended to classify anything that could be considered an innate or unchanging intelligence. But this quite quickly became forgotten. And I want to give it a brief pause to test you on something now, before explaining a little more about this test, the Army Alpha test, which was developed from Binet's ideas by Robert Yerkes and Clarence Yoakum in 1917. So you're going to have to remember your answers yourselves as I go through them, and see how many of the questions you can get correct. So firstly, 500 is played with, and the answer is cards. Secondly, carination is known as a what? A temperance agitator. And thirdly, there's a reason is an ad for a drink. Now, these are all real questions from the Army Alpha IQ test. I don't know how many people got any of those questions right, or whether you got some of them right just by chance, but that makes it, I hope, quite obvious to us today that these questions are very much based on knowledge of a particular time and a particular culture. And probably about half the questions in each of the tests are similar to these ones. But when these tests were carried out by Yerkes and the United States Army, they were deemed to make, so they drew a number of conclusions from them. When more recent immigrants performed worse on these tests, they assumed this meant that they were less intelligent than people who had lived in the country for longer, and ultimately drew the conclusion that white Americans were more intelligent than everybody else, simply because they had a better knowledge of white American culture. And you can see also in these tests here how this was based on other assumptions about culture. So the image on the right-hand side is one example from the beta test, which was for soldiers with limited literacy or English. However, these tests, where the soldier was expected to draw in the thing that was missing from each example, still relies on a lot of assumptions. If you'd ever posted a letter, say, or used a light bulb, or played tennis. And the idea that a normal adult would have done all of the things that were depicted in these pictures tended to assume a middle-class Western lifestyle. So while it's now pretty obvious to us that these tests are privileged to a certain group of people, many judgments in our societies continue to privilege certain backgrounds or exclude others. And the idea that intelligence is something innate that can be measured, and that IQ tests do measure this thing, has continued to hold force, even if there's been a lot of evidence to the contrary over the years. And I also want to mention, while we're on this subject of intelligence, how closely embedded this, as many of the other assumptions around normal have been, was with the notion of eugenics. Now, eugenics was a term introduced by Francis Galton, who mentioned earlier, in 1883. And Galton's view was that the race could be improved by encouraging people that he thought were fit to have more children, and preventing those who he didn't think were fit from having fewer children. And of course, this led to huge numbers of racist, classist, and sexist assumptions made about people, and significant detrimental impacts on people's lives and loss of lives in many examples, not least, of course, in Nazi Germany. And in relation to ideas of intelligence, examples in this country was the introduction of the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, which introduced large numbers of rules for those people who were regarded as being, as you can see in this extract, a defective. So whether they were defective or feeble-minded, a new category that was brought in by the Act that was very little defined. And as you can see from some of the examples here of why and when someone might be placed in an institution or placed under guardianship, these would fall on some people much more often than others. So, for example, those people who had much fewer means, so therefore might be more likely to be in receipt of poor relief, and also falling more often on women as well, due to the assumptions around the giving birth to an illegitimate child. So, of course, all of these things, laws, assumptions, medical and psychological tests within society shape the society of the time, which leads us to the final question, really: is society normal? Now, for Adolf Quetelet and many of the other researchers of the 19th century, the idea of normal could be applied to a society just as much as it could to a human being. They assumed that the so-called social organism, as Herbert Spencer put it, could be understood in the same way as an individual person, and therefore could be on a range, a normal range, just as a person's height or weight might be. But this wasn't really studied in terms of Western society, perhaps, until the early 20th century. In 1924, Robert and Helen Lind arrived in Muncie, Indiana, and they stayed for over a year observing the town. They published their observations as Middletown in 1929, and this became a surprise bestseller. They'd carried out thousands of surveys and questionnaires. They'd visited all sorts of organisations. They'd observed daily life in Muncie. And this became incredibly popular because for many people who heard about this in the news, who read the book, it's about so-called normal people. It was one of the first anthropological studies of Western life of this kind. However, there were a number of ways in which Muncie was assumed to be typical America. In fact, it was so much assumed to be typical America that advertisers began to use the town to test their products because they thought that it was a kind of average testing ground. But it was not actually that typical. The Linds did specify that although Middletown had a middle-of-the-road quality and many characteristic features, no claim could be made that it is a typical city, and the findings of this study can only with caution be applied to other cities or to American life in general. But this idea that Middletown did cover life in general very quickly stuck for many people. But I want to mention just two ways here in which Muncie was not typical, but then which then altered people's understandings of what was typical America. So one is in terms of gender. 90% of cities of a similar size had a greater proportion of women in paid employment. So Muncie was unusual in the number of women who were largely housewives. And it's interesting in the way this comes up time and time again through many sociological and psychological studies of the 1930s to the 1950s and beyond. This problematization of women working not working is seen as normal, perhaps in part reflective of Middletown. And a second way in which Middletown was not particularly typical was in terms of race. So according to the Linns, 92% of the population of Muncie were what they called Native American stock. And by this, they meant they were white and they'd been born in the United States. And this was higher than almost any other city in the Midwest. And then to compound this, the Linns actually investigated only the white population of Muncie. They didn't include any answers in any of their surveys from the 2,000 or so African Americans, 5.6% of the population of Muncie. So just as in the case of normotypical woman, this understanding of so-called typical society was based only on certain people within it, and excluded those who were not white, and by starting with this assumption that whiteness was supposedly normal. One other way, though, in which Muncie came to represent a particular, or Middletown came to represent a particular view of normal that was at odds with the idea of Muncie, was in terms of class. Now, the Linns saw social class as the most important factor shaping life in Muncie. It influenced the churches people attended, who they married, day or in the evening, and what car they drove. Now, according to the Linns, 70% of Muncie residents were working class. But this was not the way Middletown was represented in the media. This was shown very clearly some years later when Margaret Burke-White took a number of photographs of Muncie for Life magazine. And there was a complaint made about these photographs that they showed only the extremes and not the averages. As one writer put it, she shot only the upper and lower crust and not the middle filling of the community pie, and went on to reiterate that this was the most important part of the community pie. So this idea emerged from Middletown that the white middle class was normal, even if they were by no means the most statistically common. So finally, just to conclude, so what? Why should we be interested in this history? Well, this complicated definition of normal, whether it means an average, whether it means an ideal, continues to infiltrate our lives. And I thought this example, while coming from 1967, is quite interesting in the way it shows things that would also be very different today. So in 1967, a young resident psychiatrist at the University of Michigan, Paul Horton, decided to do a study on what the term normal meant. He was concerned it had become something of a liability for psychiatry and wondered whether it was possible to create a meaningful construct of normality. So he got quite a small sample of people, 47 junior doctors and 57 patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, to complete his questionnaire, which looked at a number of hypothetical scenarios, one of which you can see on the screen here, and the reactions of a typical normal person. Now, Horton found that results varied enormously between individuals, both as what they would do and what they thought was typical normal behaviour. So he claimed that there were three significant findings to this study. One was that most participants in the study demonstrated that they had an idea of normal, which they were willing to use to categorise behaviour. Secondly, there was remarkable variability about what this normal was and how it impacted the behaviour of a typical normal person. So in the example that I've just shown you about them being called out by their boss, the answers ranged from annoyed but decides to forget the whole thing to much anger, quits his job. This was the views of the psychiatrist. And then thirdly, most doctors consciously define their notions of normality as, quote, being a hybrid of the normality as average and normality as ideal perspectives. And I think quite a lot of Horton's findings are very interesting when we think about them in terms of the way we use normal in our own lives, in our own everyday conversations, the way we understand the term, or the way we worry about ourselves as well. So just to conclude, what is normal? Well, it's a whole range of different things. So it's been an average and an ideal at the same time. Adolf Quetelet conflated the two things, and that's continued to happen in a large number of studies in the years after him. Very often, most often in the Victorian era perhaps, but certainly in a number of studies subsequently, to be at the centre of the normal distribution was not thought to be simply chance, but something that was desirable. And to be an outlier on any characteristic was to be an error. And yet the average man, as Quetelet called him, is a myth, as we found with Norma, so-called average woman. Not one single person had the same measurements. So the average is not actually common, but could we measure what's normal by what's not unusual? Well, possibly, but very often our assumptions actually create this idea of what we think is usual or unusual. Take hallucinations. While not a majority experience, they're not a minority experience either. They are much more common than people had expected, as the census of hallucinations found. And they're not even, as some psychiatrists concluded, necessarily unhealthy. But finally, does normal simply mean the same as others? James Henry Pullen and other children in the Victorian era were identified as being different because of the introduction of mass education that showed they were not the same as their classmates. But what sameness are we measuring anyway in any of these studies? Well, the Army Alpha, Middletown, and countless other normal studies have assumed that the baseline is a white, Western, middle-class lifestyle. But that in itself meets none of the other definitions of normal. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely spectacular. And I wish we were in person doing this, because I'm absolutely sure that there will be rapturous rounds of applause, standing ovations for you now. So let's just assume that's happening right now, and you can take a bow. And now we have the formal ceremony, which we're going to do remotely using the power of the internet, where I thank you for the lecture, and with the citation, which says, to Dr. Sarah Chaney for her illuminating research on human emotions and well-being, for unpacking complicated social histories and helping us think more critically about the ideas we take for granted, very humanist values, all of those. It is my pleasure to present you with the Humanist UK's Voltaire Lecture Medal, which I'm going to hand to you here like this, and there you receive it. And again,
thank you very much.
Thank you again, Sarah. It was truly enlightening and enormously enjoyable. So I encourage all of our audience members to buy your book, which is called
Am I Normal? There we go. That's what, oh, you can't really see it with the blurred background. Am I Normal? The 200-year search for normal people and why they don't exist.
Fantastic. And so finally, I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Sarah Chaney.
Thank you very much.